Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Warning. So, this is a 2021 film that evidently doesn't come out till 6 days from now, 7 days from now. October 22nd, evidently, is when it actually comes out. But I just so happen to see this movie seemingly quite quicker than that because I'm from the future and I have the ability of being able to see movies from the future for whatever reason. Uh, but yeah, so going into this film, it's an hour and 25 minutes. And so I'm going to try and explain this movie in the best way that I can and kind of maybe spur an interest into people's minds who otherwise don't even know what this movie's about because maybe they haven't seen trailers whatsoever. I had seen this trailer, but I don't think I got a good enough like assessment of what's going on in this movie through the trailer. Uh, Plus, it was like, ooh, astronaut movie. I'm interested. So going in, where can you technically see this movie? Because I looked for it in a normal kind of setting of apps and couldn't find it anywhere. So, where can you see Warning if you want to go out of your way to say that you've seen this film? Because you can probably do so on specific apps during the second this recording. If you go on to Google, you can probably search apps, certain apps called Letter C Movies or Yes Movies and Shows. And I see Google search not go into like the Google store, and eventually you'll just get the runaround. Eventually, if you download these apps, eventually you should be able to pretty much watch pretty much everything at some point through those apps, and then eventually you'll probably at some point need to eventually go and get some upgraded app from them for some reason, because eventually that happens too. So gear up for that. But anyways, so I've been using C Movies and Yes Movies and Shows like fairly reliably for a while now, and it seems to eventually just churn me out movies that are to be early released through some means that I don't know. So go and watch this movie if you like via the apps that I just listed, or if it's really just too difficult for you to eventually be able to find these. Eventually, Fox HD Movies will probably have this movie at some point and reliably free. Or eventually, you can just wait X amount of days till this actually comes out, and like you can just be a cusp of what this movie is about. So without a doubt, what is this movie about? Now that I've seen it, so going into this movie, Warning, really this is a movie about variety, and it kind of has this like technological variety of sorts where it seems that we have certain people who are all doing technological stuff. So this bizarrely kind of reminds me of like Oats Studios, the thing that I've seen recently, um, or maybe like Love, Death, and Robots. But like it's still to be like a bunch of normal people in normal situations, and so I'm going to tell you a few of the stories, and then eventually, when we get into spoilers, like I'll tell you a lot more. So I'll tell you like very few stories, but I won't tell you like the beginning, middle, and the end of them. I'll just tell them what the big concept of certain stories are on here. So we of course have Thomas Jane, who is to be an astronaut named David in this movie, and so David eventually is to be by accident to forcibly just be left floating into space, seemingly for this entire film. Maybe making amends for mistakes that he has made in his life, or eventually wanting to maybe possibly send some messages to Earth when they are to possibly find his corpse floating in space. Because what else could he do with time on his hands now that he can't do what he is supposed to do? Interesting enough, we had David's character who is to be called the maintenance man of space, and so I guess they're gonna have to go and hire a new guy, so to speak. So there's to be another story simply about uh, a girl who ends up going with a man to see uh, to have her see his parents, and eventually this girl goes off and is to eventually have this guy who is so smitten with this girl that he decides that he is going to shut off his immortal switch. So this guy can live forever, and this girl decided to choose not to live forever, to die naturally. And we end up having this guy who chooses, like, well, you know what? Like, I am so in love with this woman that I think I shall too die naturally. And his mother's like, say what now? And so that is another story. Here's another interesting story. We end up having a girl who is to basically answer to a technological device that basically she is to call God. And basically, this God device is to record this girl's sins and this girl's Claire. And so eventually this device is to crap out at some point, and it seems that Claire is to be in desperate need of God, and but God isn't there. God isn't there to respond, and so Claire like is to eventually call like the help service to just have her be comforted by some voice of some kind, and they won't do that for her. So yeah, like that's three interesting stories right there, right off the bat. There are a couple other ones that eventually I will have to bust out here. Just a few after that. So like it's just a mixture of a bunch of tales that seemingly don't completely intertwine with one another, but there is a like small minute connection. There might be one story that may connect with another, but that's just like it's a rare thing. So with that said, so it's like a variety story in one story of one film that's like an hour and 25 minutes long. And so you decide whether you want to go and find this movie on some app somewhere and pay for it, or eventually watch it for free, or eventually just like roll the dice because you just like watching new releases. So with that said, now let's just go into spoilers. Let's just go on and let's talk about this movie. Just kind of talk about maybe some of the stuff that I didn't mention in the cryptic like sense, because it's that customary time yet again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So if anything, like this is really just legitimately like, hey guys, this is out, and what is it about? Is it good? Before I go, I guess the grading system of the cryptic like sense. I would say that this movie is really interesting, but I don't know if it like if this movie was to like if people were telling me, well, is it theater worthy? I would probably say no. Is it to have eventually been pushed onto some app somewhere and you can conveniently watch it? Yeah, that would fit the bill. Like, I don't know if I would like really just. I would probably want this on an Amazon Prime or possibly like a Netflix somewhere, or Hulu, something like that. Like, I don't know if I would really go out of my way to go to a theater and watch this movie, but some people may feel differently. Some people are like, oh man, this actually sounds better than what I thought it was about, and maybe I should go and see this in theaters because this seems interesting. So my main thing is to really just say this movie is interesting, and for the level of that, like, I don't know, like, I can't quite grade a level of, like, from 1 to 10, how interesting was this movie? Like, I just felt that um, that really was just a interesting, if not going into like good movie, just because I've kind of seen this like technology stuff being played out before. But like, I wouldn't say that it's like take my money worthy. Where like I would just say like, hey, like if you can conveniently watch this on some app for free because you already had the app anyways, then go ahead. Uh, like definitely go and watch this then. But I think this deserves to just quickly go to some app somewhere. I don't feel like it needs to be released in a theater, especially with it being an hour and 25 minutes, and especially doesn't feel justifiable to chuck this into a theater. It doesn't make sense. And plus, considering it's be delivering October 22nd, more than likely they're just going to naturally assume that probably everyone's just going to want to go to the theater because it's October, and so everybody just is wanting to just get this and get it out. But without a doubt, by the time this movie actually comes out, it'll probably be put into some app somewhere. So I don't know. Anyways, so pushing on. So spoilers now. So let's go into this. So Dave, like I said, is the maintenance man of space. And so it seems like he's working on this satellite. And so all of a sudden, this satellite ends up getting this weird lightning strike in space. Because I guess that can, like, technically happen. Like, there is, like, storms and stuff in space, which is kind of weird, but still. Uh, or either that, or like this satellite just has this electrical surge of some kind that ends up knocking Dave from off this satellite. And so all of a sudden, Dave is now floating in space and there's nothing he can do. Every time he is to try to call what I guess would be his equivalent of NASA, or to try and call just anybody to get help, like it seems like he can't get to anybody. But weirdly, people on Earth know that this guy is just floating around. So it's like they know something, but like I guess they're not gonna do anything about it. Just like, oh man, I guess like that sucks. Just let this guy float off into Earth. And plus, he only has X amount of things of oxygen left. So, so let's kind of really just cover everything going on with David, and then we'll move on. Like we'll just kind of move to person to person to person because that'll be a lot easier than having to split all these stories. Because eventually they come back around to some of these things, and then eventually they just do these one-off like kind of stories. So, so David is to eventually go and float off into space, and so I'm not going to do this perfectly like the movie. I'm going to do it in the way of which that I usually like to do it. So David's floating off, and so all of a sudden he is to bring up that he was to have a daughter that it seemed that he never really wanted this daughter, sadly, but it seems like this daughter has always ever wanted David. And so eventually David decides, like with his last breaths, to just decide to make a message to his daughter that he never really wanted, and is to just kind of make up this message for her because that's all he can really do besides just float and just talk to this AI, which is not going to really legitimately help him. And So eventually David is to make this message, and then eventually also David is to call out to God, just be like, "Hey God, you know what, man? like I know you might be really busy, but like, hey, like I'm just floating in space here. Like, you think you can help me out? Help a brother out, you know? Like I'm just floating out here." So all of a sudden at the very end of the movie, all of a sudden, God, via his voice, is to eventually answer David and say, "Oh, hey, David, yeah, like I'm gonna go and I'm gonna help you out. Like, I'm sorry, buddy. It's like I was really busy. Like, I was handling a lot of stuff, and so now I can get to you now. I can help you now." And so eventually, that's how the actual movie ends, but there's so much other stories going on that I'm going to talk about. But like the David thing is focused in the very beginning of this and at the end of this, and there's a bunch of stories in the middle. So let's eventually start breaking those down. So we end up having seemingly this guy who is trying to sell these robots and or these artificial life form drone things or robot whatever, anyways, pushing on. So all of these robots look very much human, and so it seems like this guy is desperately trying to sell these older models, but nobody really wants the older models. Everybody wants the new flashy models. And so Brian is desperately trying to sell this one model called Charlie, and this girl is to eventually want to, like, okay, let me see this Charlie guy. Like, can his clothes change? And so the Brian is like, sure. So all of a sudden, Charlie's to be this kind of old timey kind of character where eventually uh, this girl is to mention that he's going to use him possibly for winemaking. And so Charlie ends up making a wine joke about uh, you know what happens when a grape gets squished, or you know what a grape says when it gets squished? Nothing. It just whines. Ha! So all of a sudden, Brian is to talk to the seller away from Charlie, and obviously the seller wants nothing to do with Charlie. So eventually it just gets to the point where Brian is to just have to euthanize, which is basically to murder Charlie and crush him down for spare parts. So I guess try and sell him somehow, or to eventually recycle him to, I guess, make a new kind of robot because he just can't sell these older models. So, really, that's that whole story right there. It's just like, wow, it's a real page turner, that one. So let's go on to Claire's story. So Claire is to, of course, seemingly have this device that she is to call God that is weirdly collecting her sins, and evidently she is to confess at certain times about, or just kind of really just eventually own up to the stuff that she had done to kind of take down certain sins. So Claire at some points is to curse, and we have the God device who is accepting that as some sin. And so eventually, Claire's sins are bizarrely accumulating to eventually have supposedly 9 sins. And if she ends up getting this 10th sin, like she ends up getting a toaster. Like, no, that's not what she gets. Evidently, she has to try to work off these sins by eventually trying to eventually make up for them somehow, or try to do the right thing. So, because her ninth sin is Claire going and backing into this one car by accident. And so Claire goes, and you would have assumed left information for this guy, but instead she ends up leaving a note saying happens, have a nice day kind of thing, where it's just like good luck or some crap like that. Not really owning up to the sin, but it's whatever. So eventually Claire goes on and is to uh, need to get this updated God model, and so she ends up getting the updated God model, and it seems that there is a software problem which she now has to go to customer service to try and correct. And so like there's this kind of weird goofy thing, like God is a like a transaction, or God is like, well, are you sure that you like didn't turn your God on long enough? Are you sure you talked to God like the right way? Like it's like, okay, so like we have to figure out how to turn God back on, like as if he's some light switch weirdly. So eventually Claire goes to this customer service, and so they're like, well, it seems to really just be a software problem, and all you really have to do is to just hold and turn him on. Um, but it seemed that she had to go and make an appointment to go and talk to this customer service thing. So she was without God for 24 hours, and like the woman was to recommend, it's like, well, what do I do in the meantime? And the guy is like, well, just pray manually, just put your hands together and just pray to God. And so Claire does that, and the weird thing of it is since she doesn't have a device with her because she carries this thing all around with her, she is to start putting her hands together and praying to God. But since she ends up getting no answer, she is to say like, man, this praying thing is like manually is stupid. So she ends up calling customer service because her praying in a manual sense is just ridiculous because no one is to really answer her. She desperately just wants someone to, in some kind of tone, give her some kind of answer, like a quote of the day or some kind of goofy thing, to motivate Claire to eventually continue on her days. So eventually Claire starts dipping into sin a little bit, going and watching like a TV show where we have people just kind of touching their bodies and whatever on like some commercial or some show or something. And so eventually Claire is also to like cuss a little bit and whatever. So eventually Claire does get this new model, and all of a sudden it is to be start talking to her in Spanish. And so evidently Claire is to know the translation, and it's like, oh yeah, I speak English. And like she ends up saying that in Spanish of yo hablas inglés. Yo hablas, yeah, yo hablas inglés. Because como uh, yo hablo, yeah. Anyways, uh, I think I got the translational word right. Anyways, yeah, because tu hablas inglés, or tu hablas español, or tu hablas inglés. Uh, you speak, yeah. Anyways, pushing on. That's kind of the introduction of Spanish, where you kind of learn like the intro words, and eventually you could probably get around somewhere. Eventually, I don't know about that, but anyways, give somebody a map and they'll be lost. Anyways, pushing on. So Claire eventually is to talk to this new God device, and it really seems like she does not like it because it's drastically different than her other device. Because this device all of a sudden has all these like ads and commercials and all this stuff, and Claire doesn't like that. She's like, "Why are you giving me all these ads? Like, stop giving me all the ads. And eventually, uh, the God device is to be like, well, then you need another upgrade then. And she's like, no. And so she ends up taking this device and chucking it out the window and is just going to ignore it. And like that's the resolution of that story is her just chucking the God device out and just doing whatever she freaking wants. So, uh, now we push on to another story. So it seems that there is to be this guy, I believe his name is Ben, and so Ben is to be seemingly infatuated with this girl named Anna, and it seems that he has this kind of weird Oculus Rift VR device that ends up going into Anna's memories and consistently playing them over and over and over again, whatever memory that he wants to see from her. And so eventually he keeps doing this over and over and over again. He just can't stop till eventually Anna has to forcibly confront Ben in the real world to say like, hey, like you need to stop doing this. Like if anything, uh like it's just really like ruining my life and you need to just stop this. And like Ben is like, well, it's ruining my life too. And so and eventually it keeps appearing that there is this like Reaper character that keeps appearing for whatever goofy reason. And so it eventually seems that we just get towards the end of this where eventually Ben is to just consistently like keep viewing these imageries and whatever. Like it's the one kind of thing where I guess he's just like, well, he's just addicted and he just can't stop. And like this girl's even said like, I wish I could block you. And he's like, well, you can't. So so like that's kind of how things eventually just start to just play out. So uh next we have another story. What a weird sidebar. But these stories are just kind of goofy. Uh but then also like I don't know how every one of them perfectly end. Like a lot of them are just kind of like meh kind of stories compared to some others. So now we have Liam and Nina. So Liam is to go to showcase Nina to his mother and family. Really, just his mother, because like his mother is the only thing that I guess really matters. So, so we go on to eventually having Liam, who seems to be coming from an uber rich family. Like we just have like this high tech house and whichever, to where like we have a garage that ends up just kind of like going down weirdly as like some weird bizarrish god, what is the word, uh like Tupperware, like how you kind of like seal in the car, like I guess that's what they do with their cars in future. So Nina and Liam are to go off, and Nina's like, well, do you think that your mother will accept me? And Liam's like, well, like, I think that's not going to be a problem. So eventually we go on into dinner, and so eventually they just kind of bring up that Nina is to seemingly not be immortal. And so Liam's mother is just to kind of mention, like, why are you wasting your time with her? Like, she is eventually going to wither away and die. So, like, you're kind of just wasting your time. Like, you're going to live forever. Like, if she doesn't live forever, then, like you're just wasting your time with her. Like, you should just move on to someone else. And that's when Liam is decide, well, like I'm going to not live forever then. I'm going to eventually die naturally when Nina dies. So Liam's mother is like, well, that's a really big step. Like, if anything, maybe at some point, if you choose to kind of flip that kind of switch, eventually also, like, you can eventually be like deleted or have your mind wiped or whatever, and like kind of do any number of things. So eventually we have Nina, who is to eventually just kind of walk through the house at night to eventually find out that Liam is seemingly getting his mind erased, because eventually when Nina is to bump into Liam, Liam doesn't even know who she is. And so Nina's like, "Oh my god," and then she ends up like just running off because the guy that she loved had vanished and does no longer exist anymore. And there's possibly no way that she's going to get that guy back. So she might as well just go off and just die naturally, while we have Liam, who's just this immortal guy that doesn't remember his past. So next up, we have this girl who's to be Magda. So Magda, I think, is younger than what she is to say that she is. I think she's a 17-year-old saying that she's an 18-year-old, possibly, because she wants to eventually get a big fat stack of cash uh, by doing this experiment. And because I guess she wants to get out of the trailer park, so she really just wants to get a big fat stack of cash to be able to get out of her life, to be able to get freedom. So Magna goes and does this experiment, and supposedly the experiment is to eventually have someone else in this girl's body, and they can take control of her body and do whatever they want with her for X amount of time. And so this girl ends up bringing up the thing of like, well, what if this guy is in my body and he ends up like doing something to cause my death? And so the person who's putting this whole thing together, she's like, well, if he ends up killing you because he's inside of you, then that'll end up costing him a ton of money when he comes out of this, and like it won't be worth it for him to do this kind of thing. And so Magna's like, well, I guess that can be a like I guess that could be a just a justifiable thing, I guess. So but she's just kind of hoping that like the guy doesn't end up like hurting her or killing her or injuring her during this whole thing, because he basically has like reins to a car, or kind of the steering wheel to this car, so might as well just kind of floor it, if you know what I mean, right? So eventually the first thing Magna is to do when Magna is this other person is to immediately just go and find a toy and just find a way to pleasure herself, to just kind of tell the difference between, of course, a man and a female. And so eventually we, after that, have Magna, who is this guy, eventually go out to this bar where eventually he's to meet a couple women, eventually she's to meet a couple women. And so eventually they end up meeting this guy who is to be Vincent, who is to eventually go and give them drugs. So Magna is gonna go and try this drug because she's like, well, might as well, because it's not gonna affect me. It's gonna affect this other person in the long run. I can do as much drugs as I want, as long as it doesn't really kill me. So eventually, what Magna ends up happening to her is, so Magna ends up taking them to her room, and eventually we find out that Vincent is to be taking advantage of these women, and Magna is to be waking up while Vincent is trying to take advantage of her. And so she wakes up. Vincent ends up going and kind of hurting Magna, but then eventually this guy ends up getting pulled off of Magna and runs off. And then eventually the girls supposedly take care of Magna. and bring her back to her home, finding out that she's actually 17. And so they end up going and dropping her off by her trailer park. And then eventually she ends up coming back the next day, laying next to her other bodied person to, I guess, accept the fate of whatever is to happen to her next, or to have enjoyed this time and whatever. So, uh, I think the last thing that we are to actually see here. So, David had mentioned about this girl that he had spurned, and so eventually we find out this girl has a tiny tweet bit of a story where this girl is to be seemingly outside Claire's apartment, and Claire is to mention this girl. It's like, where are your parents? And like obviously there's an answer to that. And so eventually at some point in this movie, when all heck is like really just breaking loose, from what it seems like, that all of a sudden, uh, like Earth is on DEFCON 1, and supposedly there's this new strain of Cove going around, like Cove version 25, that is to eventually be this, like, seemingly this extreme kind of thing. And so maybe it's COVID aquamarine at this point. So uh, so eventually, what ends up happening is everybody is in chaos. Rioting is going on in the streets because of hearing of this, and so all of a sudden, everybody is to rush to go down into this subway station, and because chaos is to seemingly be popping off right now, and it seems that eventually we have all these people that make it into this subway station, and they are to just kind of like sit into the subway station. And then it seems that there is to be some kind of explosions of some kind that end up going off all over the world. And so I guess that thins out the herd a little bit on Earth, I guess. Like I really just didn't understand that whole spot where everything is like descending into anarchy all at one time. I guess because David is to be like stuck in space and he's almost going to die soon. And so the world is going in chaos because of this one astronaut. And so David is to see this chaos unfolding, even really just uh, on the outskirts of Earth, kind of watching on as there to seemingly be like bombs of sorts going off. So, and then eventually that eventually turns into that David is going to be hearing the voice of God and just be like, "Hey, David, like I'm here, buddy. Like I'm here. Like I was busy, but now I'm not quite. Like I kind of moved my schedule around, if you know what I mean. So yeah, so that's how the movie just weirdly ends. Like if anything, I probably didn't get this all perfectly out there, and I might have forgotten a thing or two or a step or two, but I also think that it probably won't matter right now. If anything, maybe in a week it might will. But I can't like I can't guarantee that. That's a sad thing. I can't say that certain things are just going to go uberly well because there is no guarantee. And so, like, eventually in a week or so, maybe no one will even know this movie exists, which will suck. But it looks like from the trailer, it looks like this movie is interesting enough to grab people's attention. It seems like there's possibly enough star power in this movie to maybe get somebody. Uh, Thomas Jane hasn't done anything in a while, seemingly, since, like, really, like, to me, probably, like, you could probably say The Mist or, like, Dreamcatcher, or, like, that was probably the last real thing that I saw, like, Thomas Jane do. I know that there was some movie where he was to be with this one woman, and he was in this RV, and it was something about a missing girl. Maybe it was something as simple as that, whereas like the missing or something like that, or missing or something like that. But um, so I guess that was probably the most current thing. Him and the guy from Lost Boys, the guy from Lost Boys was like the sheriff in that movie. I don't know. You can probably IMDb it up and probably figure that out. But without a doubt, I think I'm gonna get out of here. This movie was like an hour and 25, and I'm getting close to 40 minutes. So I'm gonna get out of here because this review may not matter. Because I don't know what it is, especially with recent reviews. Like recent reviews have just kind of leveled out, I guess. Because man, like we were banging on all cylinders for a while. But eventually at some point like it has to just eventually be this slow trickle of things because I just will just like, okay, this sounds like an interesting new release thing to go and talk about. And it all depends on if somebody knows it exists also. Like, hey, yeah, this should be a thing that people like. And it's like, no. But why not? I don't know. But what? Jibaba? No. All right. So I'm gonna get out of here because I've stretched out this as long as I can. So goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.